Assalamu alaikum. In the previous lecture, we have already seen that the solutions to desertifications must be integrated, meaning that there is no single solution to a complex problem. And we have seen that starting from understanding the situation until ending up with implementation of particular solution and monitoring and getting continuous feedback to see whether that solution is working or not. And another very important thing that we have discussed, that the solutions must be integrated and combined, meaning that you must apply different solutions considering and looking at all the aspects, including the environmental aspect of the problem, the socio-economic and the political things, so you can have better success. Today's lecture, we're going to continue with the desertification, combating desertification, and we're going to continue with the other types of biophysical solutions, starting with the watering conservation, harvesting, erosion reduction, grazing management, controlling soil salinity, wildfire control, and then we're going to see how the political and socio-economic solutions are integrated and very important to support the physical or biophysical solutions. So let's start. One of the very important solutions, particularly for arid countries, is the water conservation or water harvesting. Now, in this method, what you are trying to do is basically either to save the water, the available water resources that you have, like the surface water, groundwater, soil water, or you are trying to increase the availability of this water. And as we said, this technique is very important, especially for arid countries where water resources is very limited. So what you can do here is basically you would start with conserving the existing waters. And by doing that, you can use, for example, the modern irrigation systems that would eventually minimizes evaporation and also the drainage water losses. Another technique is to use mulching or no-till. Now, these two things can help to minimize evaporative water losses. By this, you are saving more water in the soil. Terraces, stone bunds, vegetation also can work very well to minimize the risk of erosion, by which that when you control the slope of the land, you are basically controlling the runoff and giving the water more chance to be infiltrated into the soil and recharged instead of flowing over the surface and being lost. Other techniques including the augmentation methods, and the augmentations method, again, you are intending to increase the availability of water. And you can do this by harvesting rainfall water, for example. You can apply fog collection, especially if the area have a lot of fog, so you harvest water from the sky. Or you can use like dams, by which you make use of the runoff water, and instead of letting it running over the surface, you detain it and you allow it to recharge your groundwater resources. Another technique is to use half moon. Now, half moon, as you can see in the picture, where you create a mini catchment that looks like half moon, and this technique is applied in many African countries. Now, one of the advantages of this technique is that it's very simple and it does not need so much effort. What does, just like in Africa, people shape it with their hands or with their shovels, and the idea of it is basically as it rains, it collects that rain and then it holds it in that particular place where they have vegetation, and they found it so much efficient. Desalination is another technique that has been applied in many different countries where they have access to the seawater, like in many European countries and also in many Gulf area countries, like Oman. Even we are using it in Oman, like to desalinate either the seawater and use that water resources for irrigation, or to supply it for the land use, or to supply it to people, like to use it for drinking and so on. And by this you reduce the stress on the other water sources that can be used for agriculture. Or you might also desalinate the groundwater, especially if its salinity is very high. Also in arid countries, they are practicing a lot reusing of the treated wastewater, and they use it, and it acts as an additional water sources. Now, things that you keep in mind here is the effectiveness of these solutions. Some of these techniques might be very easily done. It's cost effective, very cheap. Other techniques can be very expensive, like the desalination, building dams, or fog collection and reuse of treated wastewater. So it depends on the situation and the country, and it's your choice. But the easiest methods are the better and the efficient, like just normal practices using of mulch or no-till or other kind of things. So keep this in mind. Another example of the biophysical solution is erosion reduction. Now, erosion reduction techniques are meant to reduce the risk or the losses of soil due to erosion. And you can do this by two different ways. The first is by reducing the sensitivity and the susceptibility of the land to erosion, by which you are trying to reduce the eroding agents, like you're trying to reduce the erodibility of the soil, and you can do that simply by the addition of organic matter, or reducing the effect of slope, or putting some structures that control the flow over the surface, especially in slopy areas. The second technique that you can use to reduce erosion is reducing the impact of rainfall erosivity, and this means that you are trying to reduce the direct effect of the rainfall on the surface. As you studied before, that as rainfall hits the surface, it can cause some erosive losses, and you can do this simply by having more vegetative cover. Things again must be weighted with cost. The success and the cost always like a dilemma for us that we have to keep in mind, especially when dealing with these kind of decision makings and these kind of engineering structures. So we can use different techniques, especially those like the structural measures, like having the terraces, the gully blocks, like what you see here in the picture, with the man standing, or you can use check dams or stone bunds. All of these techniques are fantastic. It might work, but it is really expensive. And another thing that I want you to keep in mind, that it does not guarantee 100% solving the problem. Let me give you an example. For example, you can have a dam, or you can build a dam in the upstream region, by which you detain the flowing water or the runoff or the wadi, and allowing that water to recharge. However, when you detain it, you are also reducing the sediment, and water sometimes can overflow, and the fresh water is more erosive than the sediment, the water with the sediment. So that can create downstream erosion. Another thing that might happen, that sometimes you just like block the water upstream, and then you infiltrate that water, allow it to recharge, but it can cause flooding problems in the upstream, or might cause also water shortage in downstream. So all of these things must be planned very well and must be studied very well, so you can have an effective solution. Grazing management is another biophysical solution, by which it's meant to create a balance between the growth of the vegetation and the recovery of the vegetative cover, and also the intensity of grazing. So you have to keep in mind these two things. And usually grazing management is very important, especially when we talk about nomad people, because it's also very related to the management, how we deal with it. Let's assume that for nomadic people, normal conditions, that if they herd their cattle or their sheep and they usually follow the rain, then that's no problem, because they always go to the places where it rains. Then you have vegetation, and they leave the areas to recover where it didn't rain. So they allow this balance of vegetation. However, if they ignore these things and keep grazing on one zone, then they will cause overgrazing, and that would cause desertification and land degradation at the end of the day. How can you control this? You can use, for example, rotational grazing, and in rotational grazing, as we described, that you have to rotate the grazing from one area to another, and that would allow enough time for vegetation to recover in the first place that you have been grazing. Another technique is to use enclosing pasture, and in enclosing pasture, you are trying to enclose the area, so you protect one area. You protect the area, so you stop the cattle and the sheep to come into that area, and then you graze them in that particular area, but you have to move them after some time. So you have to know all of these times when you should move them to the other area. However, this can lead to a problem if you didn't manage it very well. That's why the management is the most important thing. Let's assume that you enclose these cattle and sheep in one area, and they have been kept to graze for a longer time. Then they can intensely create pressure on that area and cause overgrazing, and the other areas might not suffer the stress. So you have to manage these things. The third technique that you can use to control grazing and to manage it is to grow a type of fodders that can withstand the situation. I mean, can live with the condition, with the current environment that you have. It's adapted to the climate change, for example, and they can still give a higher nutritional value. So by doing that, you ensure the sustainability of the vegetative cover in the area. Salinity is another very serious problem that leads to desertification, and therefore we have also to deal with it and to control it. And the idea of salinity control is basically to minimize the effect of salinity. Now, dry lands or dry areas are more susceptible to this problem, as you see from the map, because in these areas you have a lot of challenges. Number one, it depends on the irrigation water and the evaporation rate. Usually in dry lands, because of the limited water resources and because of the high evaporation rates, then what happens, as you see in the picture, that when you apply irrigation, it basically evaporates and the salt will be left in the soil, and along the time it will build up to a level that the plant cannot endure. Water quality is another challenge for dry lands. Like in some areas you might have saline water, and again with high evaporation that accelerate the accumulation of salt in the soil and ended up to degrade the land. In some areas and in some countries like Australia, they also face the problem of shallow saline groundwater. Now in this case, that the water table is very close to the surface, and the quality of that water can be saline, and therefore you cannot grow anything on that soil. Things can also happen if you have, and this problem can also happen if you didn't manage your irrigation practice. If you apply so much water and you have a poorly drained soil, like a soil with a low permeability, then you might end up with drainage problem. And in this condition, you must solve it, otherwise it will create salinity, and then it will end up with degrading the land and desertification. Now, how would you solve it? Well, one of the basic things that you can do is to use efficient irrigation techniques. Why? Because if you use an efficient irrigation techniques, it means that you're gonna minimize the water losses either through drainage or through evaporation and so on. And by this, you use less water, and hence you conserve the water resources that you have. And not only that, if you use a good quality water, then you can flush the soil and you can leach the salt out from the soil. In conditions where you have improper drainage system or poorly drained soil, then you may need to install drainage system. that would help to drain the water and divert the water from the soil to other areas, so you don't end up with creating a logging condition and salinity issues. Another very important thing that we have to keep in mind, that if we cannot fight the problem so much, we have to adapt with it and we have to live with it. And you can live with the salinity by growing, for example, by having the proper types of crops that can live with it. So you can select crops that are tolerant to salinity and so on. In some situations, the scientists now showing success of using plant growth promoting bacteria, which are basically bacteria that help the plant to survive the salinity condition or the saline condition, by which it provides them with it. They create like a mutual symbiosis relationship, by which the bacteria can provide them with the food and help them to extract and use that water, while the plants support them with the food that they need. So these kind of things. Wildfire control is very important, especially for these countries or forests which face frequent fire occurrence. And we have seen in the news what happened in Australia and what also is happening in the US, in California, and in many other places, in Indonesia, and in many other places in the world. So that's why you have to control the fire in order to protect these forests and prevent land degradation. Now, you can do these things by two different ways. Things that you do before the occurrence in fires, and then you have things that you do after the occurrence of fire. So the first things that you do to prevent the spread of fire before the occurrence of the fire or wildfire is to have a fire hazard reduction. And you can do this by two techniques. The first one is the fuel load reduction method, and this technique is meant basically to reduce or to get rid of all the things that might cause fire and can create the problems or aggravate the problems, like the unnecessary grass, the vegetation that can grow on the surface. Like, you try to minimize them, and you can use herbicides or grazing or plowing at individual trees. So once you remove them, then if fires occur, then since you remove them, you are limiting the spread of fire and you are protecting the forest. The second technique that you use is the forest and land management changes. And here, for example, you can use or you can select plant or tree species that can live with the climate and the topographic characteristics, and that would limit the spread of fire. Or you can do what is called prescribed fire or controlled fire burn. Now, what is prescribed fire? Prescribed fire or controlled burn is basically you are doing it intentionally. Like, you plan and you create you plan how to do it, and you expect what would be the damage in order to intentionally burn some of the vegetation in order to control the spread of fire. So again, to do this, you must have, like what they do usually, they have a fire or forest service, like in these countries, where they plan how to do it. They make everything ready and then go with this plan to burn some of the areas, like some of the grasses and so on. And by doing that, they limit. However, if forest fire happens, then you have to do post-fire remediation, by which you are trying basically to improve the situation or reduce the risk of degrading the land, and also helping the forest to recover and get back to its normal situation. And you can do three types of activities. First one is called emergency stabilization, and in this technique you are basically trying to go to the burnt areas and you try to put things that would minimize the erosion, for example, like having mulches, log barriers, and other techniques. And the second one is basically to have rehabilitation, and this is, for example, when we talk about the roads, the bridges, and the trees. So you are trying to restore all of these. You are trying actually to like repair these things and again like fix the damage. Restoration is the third category or the third type of post-fire remediation, and this is a long-term measures. And what it meant to do that you are trying to you are trying to bring the forest to its normal situation, by which, if you can, like you can see in this picture down here, in the burn side where you already lost some of the vegetation, so you are trying to grow them again and help them to grow, and therefore the forest can recover on time. But of course, like this technique or these things might take longer time, because you know, like for plant to grow and recover, it needs time. Moving to talk about political and socio-economic solutions. Now, we cannot ignore these things, these solutions, and it must be implemented with the biophysical solutions. Why? Because political and socio-economic solutions are basically the environment that helps to introduce, implement, and adapt different biophysical solutions. So if you don't have the suitable condition, like the suitable policy or the economic value of these as solutions, then the solutions or the biophysical solutions might not work and people might not accept it, and then it end up with problems, or it end up with not applied or just like being implemented for a shorter time. So to ensure the sustainability, you must have the political and socio-economic solutions in consideration and cooperation with the biophysical ones. Now, you can do these type of solutions like individually, like to apply one of the examples, or you can do a combination, and combination always better than having one example. So you can, for example, give people incentives. And what we mean by incentives, that you give them, for example, a support by which you give them subsidy that would reduce the cost of the materials that they would buy, or you might provide them with food, or like some seeds, or like seedlings, vegetation, the tools that they work to dig into the soil, and so on and so on. Or you can provide them with free training and extension. Now, something that I want you to keep in mind here, that free training and extension would be much better than giving them subsidy. Why? Because you might pay them and give them money, or provide them with these equipments that would help them to restore the land and to fix desertification. However, they might not feel the value of these things, and therefore they might waste it, or they just like feel, well, it's just like free. However, when you teach them and train them, you make them involved in the solution, and by this they will help you to do it themselves, because they know the value of what they are doing. That's why training and extension might be much better than just the subsidy, because it ensures the sustainability of the solution. Participation is another very important point, by which you include and incorporate the different stakeholders in the solution. Now, you have two different types of participation. We sometimes heard about passive participation, by which you just like inform people or inform the local or the stakeholders that, well, we are doing this project and we would like your cooperation with us to do it. So you're just informing them, but they are not directly involved in the real planning and implementation of the solution. Active participation is the second one, when you involve them, like really involve them, like you involve all of the stakeholders, like the farmers, like from the government, like the big people in the community, the big figures, people in the government and the decision makers. You bring them all and you involve them in the whole chain process of the solution, from understanding the situation all the way to implementation and getting continuous feedback. And studies have found that the active participation would actually determine the success rate of the solution to desertification. Another example activity of the political and socio-economic solution is training and extension. Now, training and extension can be done in different ways. It can be done as multiple strategy. And what we mean by multiple strategy, that you bring the people, you try to raise their awareness, you create training and workshops, seminars. You might, for example, take the people to fields where you apply the solution and teach them how to do it. Or maybe you involve them like in hands, like you train them how to grow, for example, or how to use different techniques or install this technology. So the people are really involved in the process. Another thing is basically what we call it informal farmer to farmer extension and exchange ideas. And in this method, what you are doing is that you try as a project manager to facilitate the exchange of ideas. So let's say that you try to help farmer A to go to farm B and learn from those farmers and see what the techniques that they are applying there, listen to their stories, their success, their failure. And by this, the farmers would learn from each other, and this would help in solving the problem. Sometimes people use what we call trained local promoters. And what do we mean by this? That you train particular group of farmers to use the technologies, to implement, you aware them, you make them well equipped and ready. And then you let these farmers, trained farmers, to go and train the other farmers. And this also worked very well, because you cannot train the whole people, but you can train someone, and then these people, like the trained people, can themselves spread and train the others. You would see that the things that I mentioned above about the training and extension might work very well, especially for developing countries where they cannot pay for consultancy and they don't have the money, or they don't have the access to information. However, in some developed countries, you might have different type of training and extension services. You might have what we call commercial agriculture consultants. Like, these are companies that work to provide consultancy, so you basically pay them. So nothing is free here. Or people might have the access to internet, so they can read, they can search, and they can learn from other countries, and then they just go and implement it. If people do not own the land, then it will be very risky to invest so much on it. And therefore, land tenure and land user right helps to solve this problem. So what you are trying to do with this solution, you are trying to give the people legal document that show that they own the land, or they have a right to this land. And by doing this, the people would feel very secure, and therefore they will be more acceptable to implement the solution, especially when it comes to long-term implementation. As I said, no one is ready to invest for something that in the second day or the next year somebody might come and take that land. So that's why land tenure and land user right is another very important political and socio-economic solution. Research is one of the very important things when it comes to the socio-economics and political solutions. Why? Because with research, you would be able to understand the situation, and you would be able to study the interaction between the environment, the socio-economics, and the implementation. I mean, the people and their acceptance and so on. So by this, you ensure that the solution would be sustainable, and you would learn from the mistake. And not only that, by having the research, you would fill the knowledge gap, like you will discover new things that you have no idea about it, and that can be used as a feedback to improve the project and the solution. Like what you see here in these pictures, when you have scientists working on ground, they check what is going on, get a feedback, and then help to improve the solution. Or maybe you can create like the World Atlas of Desertification, where it provides maps, free access to all peoples. It's like you're spreading the knowledge about desertification and how to solve it. So that's all about this lecture. I hope you learn new things about the solutions. Again, these are just examples and there are a lot of solutions on ground, so I would like you to search and to use your innovation and think about them. I also provide you here with some references that if you want to improve your knowledge, go to the book chapter 7, read it. You will find all the things that we have discussed here, and here are some videos that would show you different things and would expand your knowledge. So I have attached for you a video about how the people face drought and desertification in Niger, and a video describing the Prescribe burning, and another video helped you to see how to manage salinity and implement the solutions in the field, and also select them and create a suitable environment. So that's all for today. Thank you. Stay safe. Bye.